Welcome. We would like to welcome everybody that's here viewing this presentation that you're going to be listening to. You are watching ACR TV, and the show is called Thinking Without Borders. And again, for people that don't know Thinking Without Borders, it is an outshoot of a radio show that I had been doing for the past 2.5 years. And from this, as I joined ACR TV, we wanted to extend the field of operation into television. So therefore, that's pretty much, I think, the very first show that I'm going to be doing with my guest here. And the person that I have next to me is Mariana Martin, and she's from Venezuela. She's a 22-year-old woman that attends a school that's in New York City called Marymount, if it's correct.
Yeah.
And again, she's a study. Her studies are political science. She really enjoys the field of political science. And we're going to let Mariana continue this conversation. But again, you are watching Thinking Without Borders, and we welcome everybody. Mariana, welcome also to Thinking Without Borders.
Hi, Hans. Thank you for having me. Well, yes, I came to the United States 2 years ago to continue my studies. And here, I was really worried about these past elections that we have, presidential elections in Venezuela on October 7th. And I needed to do something. There's around 8,000 Venezuelans in New York and around 20,000 Venezuelans in the jurisdiction of the consulate of the Venezuela in New York. So me and a couple of wonderful people I met working here were worried about trying to convince the people to vote. In Venezuela, it's not like in the US, everybody's votes count. We don't have electoral college, it's direct. Your vote goes to your candidate. So
it's popular vote.
It's popular vote, yeah.
Great.
So we were worried about the people. There were so many people outside Venezuela, and they weren't going to vote in the past elections. So we created this organization called Embajadores del Voto, which means votes ambassador. And what we do is try to promote awareness of voting, of trying to reconnect with Venezuela through events, through campaign awareness. And as the elections were approaching, we joined Comando Venezuela, which is the group that was supporting Capriles as a candidate here in New York.
And this is where we met, actually.
Yes.
And we met right in front of the embassy.
Yes.
And I have to say that, just to start off, I thought that was very well done, because a lot of the people that were at the embassy were people that were, by and large, Capriles' people.
Yeah, we had a group of volunteers
organizing
outside, and we had fairly good relations with the consulate, so we work together, in the elections with the people from the consulate.
That to me was a very good expression of democratic values.
Yes.
And I noticed that, and I thought that was a very good thing. So, you know, a good start to what we're going to be talking about.
Yes, awesome. Yeah. And then as the elections were approaching, we became part of what was the Comando Venezuela, which was the group that was supporting Capriles' campaign in Venezuela and around the world.
Interesting. So he's had a huge amount of following outside of the country. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
In different countries also.
In different countries, yeah.
Is he also getting support from the private sectors in some of these countries as well?
Of the private
sectors.
What do you mean?
Outside, you know, the private sectors, which means corporations and stuff like that, that would be supporting candidates and things of that nature.
Not as far as I know. I know he received donations through private individuals, but that's not a topic I manage. Like we didn't give any money, had any money, but I suppose private individuals, like Venezuelans abroad, that could donate. That's
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, as you well know, for people that are looking at this, the issue of Venezuela has become Chavez, you know, and usually it's always seen through the lens of one individual, and it really is a huge omission of what has transpired since 1998 till today. Good and bad, we need to focus on the sort of the raw data that is inside the country. Generally speaking, what we've seen, especially in the United States, is that they have a tendency to sort of pigeonhole people into specific individuals that represent a government and represent something for them that becomes quote-unquote evil or quote-unquote bad. So Chavez falls within that group of, you know, the Castros, the Ahmadinejad, and so on and so forth. That is the sort of the narration of the U.S. But unfortunately, the world is not just the U.S., and unfortunately for the U.S., the world is changing dramatically, where different poles are coming in. And one of the reasons we want to bring this issue to the forefront is that I want to value the candidacy of Capriles, not through the lens of the U.S., not through the lens of private industry, but to hear, in fact, what Mariana has to say about something like that. And so we can broaden the discussion outside of the component of the vision of the U.S. and the limitation of the United States also. So that's pretty much what we find. And one of the things that I think Chavez has done is, especially in helping out, he has become, I would say, a centerpiece for what is called Latin America politics. So when you look at Chavez, in Latin America in general, when you take out the big countries, especially Brazil and Argentina, following the other countries that are behind, they have now taken, I think, a very interesting stance. And Latin America has become a geopolitical framework that needs to be reckoned with and needs to be discussed. And I think Chavez has been a very integral part of that situation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely, most definitely. When Chavez came first into power, the political situation, the social situation in Venezuela was I will say, terrible. We have the government and most of the wealth of the country was in the hands of a really, really small amount of people that were the highest classes, the richest classes. And we were literally just, there wasn't much about Venezuela happening. There wasn't much about a union of Latin America happening. And when Chavez comes, part of this crisis of this past model, because he came because that model, like, it was over. We couldn't handle it anymore. There were so many people in hunger, lack of education. So he came as a result of this failure of this model, and he came sort of as a revolutionary force, not only to change in Venezuela, but for the rest of the countries of the region to realize, well, something's happening. Maybe we have to look at this guy, like what's happening, we need to change, we need to evaluate the things that we're doing. So definitely has been like a key piece of sort of awakening, I will call it.
There's no question about it. It's an affirmation as well.
Yeah.
So which is very important. So the first thing that I would say is, in light of what we've just said, but just in general, why would the question that one has to look at? Why are you supporting Enrique Capriles in the era of Hugo Chavez, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I was saying, at the model that was before Chavez, it was terrible. It was corruption, people was no education, no food. It was really, really bad. And it was very divided between classes. So he comes as a result of a failure model. And he comes into power saying he wants to end up with corruption and he wants to promote equality and empowerment of the people.
Correct.
So I was 8 years old when that happened, by the way. So Chavez is pretty much everything that I know in my life. I was 8 when he came into power, now I'm 22. And after 14 years, it's really sad that what we have seen is sort of a repetition with changes. Obviously, it's not exactly the same of what was happening before 1998. It's like there's a lot of people that doesn't have access to food, people that have access to education, it's a lot more, but the situation of the public schools is detrimental. It's really horrible. And now it's like we have all this economic,
in which
social...
way, Mariana?
The public schools, the thing is like they have failures in infrastructure. So most of the schools, they don't have classrooms or they don't have bathrooms. And there's not enough teachers because the teachers in Venezuela, being a professor or a teacher is one of the worst paid jobs in the country. And it's dangerous because there's no any kind of security, so you can find drugs, guns, prostitution, and all the things you wouldn't imagine to find in a public school, you can find in a public school in Venezuela. It's overwhelming, it's really sad, and it's not a new problem. It's not a Chavez newly problem, but it has certainly getting worse during his time. So what is happening is that you're getting no education, no fair education for all, no quality education for all. The problem of importations and exportations, we used to produce a fairly amount of things, not a lot of things, but now the only thing we produce pretty much is oil, And thanks God, it's like really expensive now around the world, because otherwise we will be in a huge crisis. But we're importing everything, which makes me feel like I would like to have the country that he says, that we are self-sustaining as much as we can be, producing products in Venezuela and consuming products produced in Venezuela. Well, we don't. So the thing is, like, he came with these ideas of the dream country, the country that everybody needed, but he became a sort of a reflection of the model that was before him. And I don't even want to talk about the model that was before him because I was 8 years old, so I don't really remember. But what I have so far is one Venezuelan dies every half an hour. There's no education for all. The inflation is more than 30%. And there's no really a lot of opportunities for everybody. And I say, well, this guy hasn't really said, like, done what he has said.
What's the unemployment rate then?
There's not that much unemployment. It has become less because the government has expanded the rate of employment, but the unemployment is around 15%. So it's high, but it has become less.
Well, yeah. In the scheme of things, 15% is not that bad. It's pretty much comparative to the United States because the numbers that are given in the United States are usually half of that, but it's usually more than that anyway.
Yeah,
it's twice as much, really. So, but having said that, you feel that those are some of his flaws. What would you assess Capriles to be? You know, if he were president, what would you see him in terms of? What are some of these fundamental differences, whether it be neoliberalism or whatever? But how do you see Capriles bringing something new to the forefront?
Right. The interesting thing about Capriles and Chavez is, like, ideologically, they're not that different. They're both from the left. They both believe in socialism. The thing is, like, Chavez's model, it looks more like the Soviet Union's model, the Cuban model, and Capriles' models looks more like the Brazilian model and the Northern European model. He actually refers a lot to the Brazilian model. You know, if you read his interviews, he says, I want to have a government with a strong social component, with government funding a lot of social programs, but giving the opportunity to private sector to develop so the economy can move forward. And he actually says, I want to give the opportunity to private sector, but giving evidently priority to Venezuelan investors to come and produce in Venezuela, because there's a lot of Venezuelan talent and a lot of Venezuelan investors that want to invest. And he wasn't supporting, I don't think anybody in Venezuela is now, supporting of uncontrolled investment and uncontrolled markets.
Correct.
It's just a cooperation between the private sector and the government to keep the economy moving forward.
Well, you know, usually the government, of course, represents what is called the public sector, right? But there is a larger public sector in Venezuela. And when we're talking about the different communities where collectives have been organized. In other words, they're not called unions. They're really sort of cooperatives.
Yeah,
cooperatives that themselves have immersed. Now, I don't, and you know, to me that's a failure on my side, where I don't have the specific numbers in terms of what they've been able to undertake and what kind of production they've been able to produce. You know, so in other words, what is the relative factor for that group? All these different cooperatives that are really forming what I think is a very important movement in the country, because generally speaking, what we find in the private sector is a sector that has a very limited scope and also has its own vision of the world and a type of government that they would like to see. Sometimes contrary to the what you call civil society, and by and large, the population that is most or less represented, but that is at a larger number. So how does Capriles handle that kind of a grouping in terms of what has already been constructed under the rule of Chavez?
Yeah, well, definitely one of the first things about this, I wouldn't call it opposition, I wouldn't call it like this Capriles movement. Obviously, it's not just him, but this like new movement that has come in the past 2 or 3 years, is that it's not opposition, it's an alternative, and definitely it's not anti-everything that is Chavez. They want to keep what Chavez has done well, the good ideas, and they want to improve them. So it wouldn't mean, Capriles as a president, it wouldn't mean getting rid of the cooperative, getting rid of the missions. he said from the beginning, I'm going to evaluate the things that are not working, but I'm not going to vanish everything that was Chavez. The cooperatives, the thing is like, they are a great idea for empowerment, but they haven't really worked because of the amount of politics involved on it. So to form a cooperative, you definitely have to be part of the party of Chavez. You have to.
Why is that? I mean, it should be anybody.
It should be anybody. It should be anybody, but the reality is that you're not going to be given this loan because they receive a loan, they form the cooperative, and then they start to pay with a low interest rate to the government, but you don't receive the loan.
What's the interest rate generally that is charged by the government?
I'm not sure, but it's below 5%. It's really low.
Okay, very good. So,
and they don't have like specific time frames and stuff. It's like the government help them, and then they evaluate each case by each case, I guess.
Now, Chavez has a different situation right
now.
And in a sense that the candidate before Capriles lost by 26%.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to maintain that kind of a mindset when the percentage was 11%, and which means 55 to 56 to 45 or 44 in that sense, you know. So an election that was, I thought, pretty much a huge amount of voting.
Yeah, it was huge.
An election that
82% of people
82% of people that are registered to vote voted. The United States should learn from that because
I agree. I agree.
It doesn't have the ability to do that. And in fact, most of these elections in the United States have so many other problems that we can go on and on with these machines. Now, I know that there's been also some criticism about the machine. I'm not going to stay on that. I want us to go back to the point of, let's look at energy, and then we'll go back on some of these issues. On the factor of energy, one thing that his government has done is nationalize the industry of energy, which is primarily energy coming from...
Well, no. The oil was nationalized in Venezuela in 1975.
In 75?
In 75, yeah.
So how does it differ from him as opposed to what was there before then?
Well, before him, the oil was used only for energy and some other smaller programs. But what he has done is Chavez, what he has done is he has expanded the scope of the energy revenue to a lot of things, to food, education, missions, mainly everything. He can do it because when the oil industry was nationalized in 1975, the oil barrel was between $8 and $15 per barrel.
Correct.
So it was evidently they have to limit the scope of how much of this revenue are we going to spend on what. It has to be limited because it is good and we produce a lot and we have a lot and it's easy for us to produce it because it's very in the surface of the earth in Venezuela. But now the average is $100, so there's no really need to limit it because there's a lot of money getting into Venezuela daily. So what he has done is sort of I know you're confused about nationalized because now he calls it like it's for everybody, not for the higher classes, but it's because he has invested that money in a lot of different programs.
In other words, he's been able to take the revenues and spread it around as much as possible.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's understandable. Now, let's look at Capriles' record.
Yeah.
Because you've supported Capriles. You feel that he is an alternative.
Yeah.
What was his role in the government as governor in the state of Miranda? What was his performance there?
Well, I actually was born in Miranda. I lived there till I moved here. My first vote, it wasn't presidential, but it was for him. As governor, when he ran as governor, because before that he ran as mayor, but I didn't live in his municipality. So I voted for him as governor. I will say he has had a great performance. He is very beloved in the state. People really support it. People support it. Well, he won the election.
It's one of the biggest states.
It's one of the biggest states, if not the biggest on population. And his role has been really good. He has focused on the education part. We have 3 levels of public education. We have national schools, state schools, and municipality schools.
And local schools.
And district schools. Yeah, I'm trying to translate it from Spanish. That's why.
Okay, yeah, I got you. But as soon as you said it, I could
Yeah.
certainly envision the picture.
Yeah.
But how would the local differ than sort of the national then?
Because the Minister of Education is in charge of the national, the state, the governor, and and his staff will be in charge of the state schools, and the local, the mayor and his staff will be in charge of the local schools. So it's sort of better the local in general, not only with Capriles in general, schools that are managed by local governments are better because there's less and there's more people to pay attention to the schools instead of the national schools.
There's less what, Mariana?
There's less schools. It's like
fewer schools.
Fewer schools. Sorry.
Fewer schools. That's okay.
Fewer schools.
Okay.
So in general, you will think about it. Like if I have a group of 10 people and 5 schools, we can manage better than having 100 schools and a group of 20 people.
Okay. Okay.
So that's why. So he has focused on schools. He built 60 new schools as in his role as governor, and he has improved the salary of teachers, and he has created programs of after-school programs.
What percentage would you say it has increased?
Of teachers?
The percentage of increase.
Of increase of teachers?
No, the salaries.
Oh, the salaries? I'm not sure.
Okay, that's important because one of the things that if he's talking about
I'm not sure exactly the amount and percentage, but what he has done is he has tried to keep it as much close to what it will be with the 30% inflation. Because he says we have to consider a 30% inflation with his salaries.
I totally agree. Because if you don't, then it's a 30% loss. There's no question about it.
Even if you don't raise it. So it's a 30% loss.
It's a 30% loss. That's good. There's no question about it. In the United States, this is what happens.
Yeah.
You've seen salaries really stagnated, and you've seen inflationary situations go up.
Yeah.
The value of goods and services have gone up, and the salaries are either decreasing or stagnation.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much what you're seeing. So, but give me some raw footage in terms of some very specific things that he has done. Dealing with, you've given me schools. What about, homes and lodging and stuff like that? Roads. What has he done? Infrastructure. Give me some stuff like that. And how does this state rate in terms of education and also job quality as opposed to other states, if that matters?
Well, yes. In education, Miranda is one of the best in the country. Is on the top with Miranda and Zulia and San Cristobal. It's one of the top states. But what he has done also on housing is that we have a huge housing problem because Miranda is not the capital, it's not the capital district, but Caracas is shared between the capital district and Miranda. So the amount of people that have moved to Miranda and the capital district in the past 8 years is huge. Huge. Caracas, they say there's an estimate of 7 million people living there. I'm going to tell you, Caracas is like twice the size of New York. And there's like 7 million people. And we don't have the transportation that we have here in New York. So it's been really messy. So what people do is they move to what they call the slums that are actually, in our case, since Caracas is a valley, is mountains.
Yeah, and
they don't have access to water or lighting and stuff. So it's very hard to do that. So what he has done, he has made this program to work with the people, not just give them houses, but they say, we give you this amount of money, and then you go and buy the materials. And if you have people, because the thing in Venezuela is like most of the people know they're handymans, so they know how to build. And they have some sort of advisement from the governor staff to how to build a house, to build like pipes to get the water and be in the electric system, so they can have a house, but not given by the government. It's yours, but we just help you to build it. So it's like I go halfway, you come halfway, and you get your house. That has been very successful. So successful that has been one of his flags when he was doing campaign around the country, that he'll say, have you seen what is happening in Miranda? People's getting their houses. There's like, the percentage I had it on the top of my head. So like 30% decrease of people that didn't have houses now have houses through this program. Obviously, it's slower. It's slower than just giving the houses, but it's working. It's more permanent. It's their houses. It's not like they have to give something to the government or anything.
That's always a hard task. When one envisions, if you envision creating or constructing cities, you either have to create new cities. It's always harder to patch up and change things. But the government, and not just the government, and this is the biggest problem that I think countries that are not fully developed yet are always faced with, especially when a government has that kind of resources in hand. It can certainly put these emphasis on constructing not just houses, but neighborhoods. It should be constructing neighborhoods and filtering through those neighborhoods energy, education, jobs, and everything else. So that I think, what would you see, what do you foresee under Capriles as what type of Venezuela do you foresee with Capriles?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Rosales, which is the guy that ran against Chavez in 2006, because the opposition at that moment will be like, I don't care if I don't like Rosales that much, I just want to get out of Chavez.
Right.
Today,
so anti-Chavez vote.
Anti-Chavez vote, exactly. So today, it's funny because it sort of started like that. It started like we need a candidate that could beat him so we can get out of Chavez. It will be anti-Chavez. But now you talk to every Venezuelan that supported Capriles and says, it goes beyond that. Now, I want to live in a country with Capriles as a president. I want to live in a country where public education is on the top of the top. I want to live in a country where people go to school instead of getting into gangs, so the violence rate decreases. I want to live in a country where the government is not threatening me for thinking in a way. I want to live in a country where the government actually talks about union between the country and not division, and not hating the one that wears red or the one that wears blue or yellow or whatever.
Right. And I think that's a real issue, because I think Chavez, if anything, I think he needed to sort of really assemble and get people together, because it is no longer 30%. It is no longer people that are upset about this or about that. When you have numbers like 45 million, and Capriles received...
No, 45%.
45%,
yeah,
exactly.
We have 29 million.
Exactly. And Capriles received over 6 million votes.
Yeah.
I think 6.5 or 6.4 million votes.
Yeah.
To Chavez is 8 million or more at this point.
It's like 8.2, I think.
Yeah. So those things I think are very crucial.
Yeah.
Now, Chavez recently, he did a sort of a mea culpa. I don't know if did you hear his speech recently?
Which one?
His speech where he was being autocritical. There was a criticism that he was making about his governance, in terms of some of the failures, some of the flaws.
Yeah.
I didn't hear all of it. I would have preferred to have seen department heads in that government addressing that issue instead of just him.
Yeah, that's one of the big problems that as political is causing problems for him as well, because now we have elections for governors on December, and we in the alternative, all the governors and all the mayors were chosen by primary elections. His governors and his mayors, and sorry I refer as his because it's not his, like his party's governors and mayors are chosen by a small group that decides who's going to be what. So that's one of the biggest issues. Like, he is actually the only recognizable leader. That's why he has to talk and say that. And
I mean, nobody exists. It's either Chavez or nobody else.
If you ask someone that supports him, it's probably yes.
Wow.
That's what I have a few friends that support him, and I will ask him like, why do you like him? And he says, well, I don't believe in these guys, that Capriles. I don't believe in this for any reason. And I say, oh, okay, but do you think doesn't surprise you that he's the only recognizable leader? And he says, well, yeah, right now he's the only leader that can hold that party together. And I don't think that's a good thing by any means. I mean, that means he's a leader, but that means there's no space for other people to come out.
It's correct. No, we agree on that completely.
Yeah.
I think, and that would go deeper into the question of socialism that he portrays. I'm not quite sure what that situation is in terms of if one is able to construct socialism through those particular means.
Yeah.
But certainly an organization, a political party, cannot be the reflection of one person, certainly in this day and age. It's not going to work, and it has the tendency to do exactly what you said. It quilts and it sort of impedes the growth of other people.
Yeah.
It is in fact a process of many. It is a project that has to be the embodiment of many. And that to me is really where it has to go. And I think Chavez has to really take a deep, hard look at himself. And it's not about, the organization is never about one man. If it is, it's not an organization.
It's not an organization,
so,
exactly.
that to me is a real issue that I think that's the real discussion from the left. That's the real discussion that people that talk about democracy have to make in these debates. It's not about, we cannot fall prey, I think, which most people do. The discussion is always the United States. The United States puts itself right in the middle of all the discussions, and then therefore it becomes the duality of Chavez or the U.S. as other man. And the reason why we're having the show is to look at Capriles for who he is, and to not look at it, the paradigm that has been created by the United States, which is the paradigms of good and evil. Generally, the United States is not in the side of good anyway. So that's a real issue.
About that, yeah, exactly. About that, it's like one of the things I really like about Capriles is that Chavez talks a lot about the country, about the world emancipation, and really, it's important to solve the flaws of the world. It's important to stop hunger in the world. However, how are you going to do that if you haven't stopped in your own country? So what Capriles will say in his speech all the time, he will say, yes, of course, we want to be solidary with all these people because it's important. They're part of the world and we need to advance together if we want to have a good world. However, you need to focus on the problems at home first.
Right.
And he says, we need to solve these problems. So, and as a discussion of the left, I think today is this all left before the Berlin Wall and this sort of, to call it a one-way neo-left, that is focusing on social problems, on solving the problems of the people, and having a presence of the state to make sure everybody has the same opportunities, but giving space to maybe sometimes private investors that want to work with the government, sort of what Brazil is doing.
Right, and creating space which is not just space economically, but I think politically, socially, and then you expand culturally as well.
Exactly.
Now, the question that I would ask then is the neoliberalism plan, which has been, coming, and I've seen different governments in Latin America take positions against that.
Yeah.
And so the whole movement in Latin America is the movement towards...
Well, it has to be.
It has to be.
After 1980s and with Washington Consensus, it has to be.
Correct.
Like I think we learn about that a lot. Every Latin America that knows about a bit history, and it's recent history, 1980s.
That's right.
Those austerity measures enrich the rich, but impoverish the poor so much that this crisis happened.
So we're seeing it, Mariana, in Europe in a big way.
Yeah.
And now you're seeing Latin America, I think, having a completely different approach. Now, they have a long way to go, by the way. They have a long way to go yet, because they still have to sort of quilt these hungers and situations. Even Brazil, who under Lula, the 8 years of Lula, I think, we saw raise for the population of 200 to 300%.
Yeah.
But yet, still, there are 50 million people that are poor.
Yeah.
And Brazil has to deal with that situation as well. So, in essence, where does Capriles stand with this neoliberalism that is always at this beck and call from the United States, and now you're seeing it in Europe? Where does he lie in this question?
He's definitely against it. As I told you at first, he's a man of the left. He inclines to the left. And it's left. He wants to have social programs funded by the government. He wants to stay with the missions. He wants to empower the people. He wants to have public education that competes with private institutions of the world. Definitely, if you look about that, it's on the left.
No, there's no question.
However, what he says is like, if we have to cut something, we're going to cut things that don't affect the people in their day-to-day living. Today, what Chavez has done in the past 14 years is that there's so many people that depend on the government, there's so many jobs, there's so many people that depend on pensions of the government. So you cannot just say, we are broke, we're going to cut funding of everything. And we're not. The thing about Venezuela is that the wealth, again, as it was in the 80s and the early 90s, is not well distributed. There's a lot of wealth in Venezuela. However, it goes to the top people, and it goes to a lot of people through corruption. So that's what he wanted to do. He says we have to correct what we have to correct, and he said, I'm not going to fire anybody that is doing their job. However, there's a lot of people that is not really working and is receiving a salary because they support Chavez. And those things, they have to correct them regardless. But yeah, he is definitely against it. I feel like the new leadership in Venezuela, all of them are against it, because that will mean another crisis, since so many people depend on the government right now.
There's no question.
There's no question about that.
You know, the government centers so much money. Like you said, the revenues coming from the oil is a huge factor. And from that oil, there's so much that can also be done with byproducts of the oil itself.
Yeah.
So, you know, that goes without saying. One of the last things we wanted to look at is, we've discussed it a little bit, but I think one of the failures that I've noticed also in Chavez's approach is that the infrastructure in the country has really not developed. So in other words, I see outskirts that look like any poor country that has never seen oil in its life. So therefore, the outskirts of Venezuela, I don't see why in this day and age it is not totally developed.
Yeah, well, me neither. But yeah, that's what I wonder all the time. I say, we are a population of 29 million people, and we receive all this revenue from oil that is over $100 per barrel. We should have a golden country. However, we don't. Again, I don't want to be one of those persons. I don't want to blame all this in Chavez. This is not a new problem either. However, $100 a barrel, we should be great. As my mom says, we haven't built a new bridge in Caracas since 1960s. So I don't think that's one of the main concerns of Chavez governments, to develop infrastructure. I don't think they haven't really thought about it, of how important it is to expand the cities, to create new cities, to decentralize. He talks about, and our constitution talks about decentralization, but what he's doing now is centralizing all the power. So that results in people centralizing in the main cities, and the infrastructure, there's not enough infrastructure for that many people. So they should develop a lot more, and they haven't. And the thing that worries me the most is that they're not talking about it in this new period. The first things that I've talked about is about centralizing education, getting rid of PTAs and student governments, and they haven't talked about the main things about what are you going to do with security? What are you going to do with 30% inflation? What are you going to do with the lack of infrastructure in the country? So you see, what worries me the most is not a thing about ideology, it's not a thing about anything, it's a thing about this is the problems and you're not addressing the problems.
I totally agree, agree. I think sometimes ideology becomes a huge excuse for a lot of people to sort of, they can hide underneath these banners and say, I'm this, I'm that.
Yeah.
But the final analysis is really in detail. And I'm glad you brought the point that you just brought up, because the question of decentralization is the real question of democracy. It is the real question of building socialism.
Yeah.
Socialism is not about centralizing power. You know, that we see that in capitalist society. You see what happens in the United States. Even though, if you look at the laws in the United States, the construction of the republic itself, from the federal government to state governments to local governments, it gives a lot of authority and it gives a lot of possibility for a decentralization plan. But what you've seen happen over the course of in the United States over the course of the past 20, 30 years is in fact the centralizing of governance, where presidents have their kill list, you know, and have a bunch of other things that are taking place. So in essence, the decentralization not only begins in terms of infrastructure, which is paramount for goods and services to be able to move, but it's also paramount, I think, Mariana, so that people can receive schooling, can have their own jobs in their own localities. The education should reflect the localities and have the input of people in the localities. Homes should be constructed so that it fits, like you said, these new cities. And to me, if you're not doing that, it matters not what you say, it matters not where you stand, that has to be something that needs to be done. And so I'm hoping that that's something that will...
I mean, yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I don't want to compare Venezuela with the United States because it's completely different systems, history, and situation, but I will say the United States is pretty much decentralized if you compare it to Venezuela. But what I'm saying is it has never been decentralized. But in the past 14 years, the concentration of powers in one government and in one man has been so drastic that you will think, how are we going to do that? And he keeps talking about moving forward his plan of socialism of the 21st century that he hasn't even really say what it is. But he keeps saying that. And if socialism on the 21st century is what he's been doing, what we're going to see in Venezuela in the next 6 years is going to be more centralized power, more violence, death, a higher rate of death by violence, less education, and more inflation and more poverty. So it really makes me wonder. What he talks about, when I look at his speeches, at Chavez's speeches in 1998, now that I understand them, I say, well, that's obviously he won. Obviously, this system was broken and we needed something like this. I wanted the country he was talking about. And I'm sure so many people that voted for him in 98 wanted it as well. But he hasn't done it in 14 years. So people is a bit thinking, oh, well, if he hasn't done it in 14 years, what makes you think he's going to do it in 6 more years?
Correct.
That will mean 20 years.
It's a long time.
It's a long time.
Now, did you notice Lula's comments recently also?
No, I haven't.
Lula sent a message to Chavez and said, the governance of one is really a governance of failure. You know, he has to help provide an extension or a replacement of himself, really, if he wants to just to continue him.
Yeah, I mean, I feel it's beyond the political factor. I feel now it's more like egocentrism factor.
Egocentric, completely.
Egocentric, completely.
Yeah, well, guess what? It does happen when you're in power.
That long.
That long. And you have a population that supports you, that does become very egocentric and it becomes very ego-driven.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to see something different. Now, Capriles is undertaking his re-election over there.
Yeah.
What are some of the things he's looking at right now?
He is actually looking at continuing his project on housing, education, and definitely trying to work with the security issue. Is one of the biggest problems of Venezuelans. One study...
And a big problem in Latin America.
In Latin America as well, but one of the studies that came before of the pollings of the elections, one of the companies asked the people, what's your major problem as a person? And an overwhelming majority said security.
That's awful.
It's horrible. As I told you at the beginning, the statistics are like every half an hour, every 25 minutes, a Venezuelan dies of a violent cause. So they really want to work on that. Unfortunately, Capriles, the Miranda state doesn't have a police of Miranda because it was set apart by some strange policies that didn't allow the governor to have a police, because a national police came in place of the state police.
Okay.
So it's hard to fight violence if you don't have a police. It's really hard to fight violence if you don't have a police. So what you can do is do it in the long term, getting people into school, but he really wants to focus on that, on the security issue, as mostly everybody wants to do it, because it's literally killing us.
Well, we've covered quite a bit.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a sort of a last thing or a last comment that you'd like to make that will last forever.
I mean, I'm always going to be optimistic about we're going to be able to change. I'm always going to be optimistic of voting. This election wasn't as fair on the campaign aspects. However, 6.5 million people voted for Capriles. Yes. They wanted to see change in Venezuela. And I think that's an important call to us as Venezuelans, as Latin Americans as well, to think about we need to look at what we're doing wrong and start to do things well, not so much about not focus on ideology, but on solving the problems of the people.
And I think that is the strongest ideology, is to be able to deal with fundamental problems and answer them.
Yeah.
The answers are not going to be verbal. They're not going to be from an ideology that is detached from reality. Reality is to deal with people's problems and fundamental problems. The problem of jobs, the problems of schooling, the problems of housing, the problem of transport, the problem of being able to move. We are at an age where traveling should be done like this, easily. Simply what we're seeing all around the world, where new implementation of new strategies to move people from one space to the next. Human beings, this is what they've done, is the ability to move. Yeah. And creating opportunities for people to move also creates opportunities for businesses to take hold and live and just move and grow. So one thing that I would say is, I often think that the crisis of security is always a crisis of food, it's the crisis of opportunity, yeah. It's a crisis of access.
Definitely.
So when in fact governments talk about whatever they want to talk about, and they talk about socialism, they talk about democracy, if these fundamental issues are not respected and are not edified, so what we're seeing is a byproduct of that is violence. A byproduct of that is theft. And the theft not only happens at the bottom, it happens merely at the top, but you see it much more so manifests itself on the street, yeah. Where the average individual gets affected in a very, very tough way.
Every individual, yeah.
Mariana, last word.
Well, last word, yes. I'm going to keep hoping for change. I don't think it's going to happen.
And working for change.
And working for change. I don't think it's going to happen with Chavez, however, I'm going to keep working for it. And I hopefully we have Capriles next term, or not necessarily him, someone like him, maybe a woman, who knows.
Capriles is fairly young.
Yeah, Capriles he's 40 years old.
He's 40 years old.
So he has time, but I just don't want to focus on the personality issue again. He is great, and he loves his country, and he's going to stay in his country, keep working for it for the rest of his life. But he definitely gives opportunities to everybody else to be on the spotlight.
Well, you heard it from Mariana Martin, and again, you are listening to Thinking Without Borders. And the station that carries this is ACR TV. Now, back there is formerly what was ACT, but we've added ACR TV, we've added an R to it because we also have a radio side to the station. So, again, we appreciate everybody watching. And again, this is simply one of the shows that we're going to be doing. This is the beginning. This is the kicking off. And we just kicked it off with Mariana Martin, directly from Venezuela, but who lives in the United States and has been going to school in the United States. And again, we thank everybody that's watching this, and we tell them we'll see you next week.